Chapter 24. Go Play Outside. Now that the TV was gone, the boys decided to follow their mother's advice. Go play outside. One afternoon, his brothers ran inside to invite little Eddie to come out and play a special game they'd invented. Cowboy and Indians. "Isn't that supposed to be cowboys and Indians?" Eddie asked. "No, not this time. You're going to be the cowboy, and we're going to be the Indians." When he asked how to play, they led him outside to the edge of the yard and carefully tied him to a young sassafras tree. Then, when he was secure, they began to pile brushwood up around his feet. When it got to the height of his knees, they produced a box of matches and commenced lighting the fire. As the smoke started to rise, Eddie's brothers ran off laughing. Eddie began to holler. Fortunately, his mother was standing at the kitchen sink doing dishes. She had a good view of the backyard and was accustomed to keeping vigil over her cubs from that vantage point. At that moment, she spotted a low cloud of smoke drifting across the yard. A second later, she heard Eddie shriek. Drying her hands, she stepped out the back door to see what was going on. There was her firstborn, tied to a burning stake, and somewhere from behind the bushes she could clearly make out the sound of stifled giggles. As she untied the knots, Eddie looked up into his mother's face. They may have had their differences at times, but at that moment, she was his favorite person in the world. Eddie and the boys were always building something in the backyard. One time, for their father's birthday, they selected a young locust tree and nearly killed themselves hoisting a 200-pound purple martin house to the fragile branches in the top. Another time, they went into the woods and cut down 20-foot saplings. They dragged them back to the yard and practiced the lashing they'd learned in Boy Scouts. They formed enormous tripods that looked disturbingly similar to illustrations from the War of the Worlds and left them dotted around the yard. One of their best creations was a huge rope swing suspended from an old apple tree on the hillside out back. The rope was a good 20 feet long, with a piece of wood tied to the bottom to make a seat. They tried all variations of pushing and running with the swing to gain more altitude, but they found that tying a secondary rope halfway up the main rope produced effects worthy of a theme park. As the swinger was sailing forward, out over the void, the puller would haul back on the control rope, causing the swinger to soar skyward with his feet aiming toward the clouds. The altitude that could be produced was breathtaking. During their time at Racine, Eddie's folks must have decided life was too tame, because they brought home a couple of foster brothers. They hadn't really planned on it. They'd been down to the jail to visit an acquaintance of Eddie's dad and happened to see two kids sitting behind bars. "What'd they do?" asked Eddie's mom. "Oh, nothing. Their folks are in jail for fighting, and we haven't got any place to keep the kids." "Well, I'll take them," said Eddie's mom. And so Eddie wound up with two more brothers, Perry and Ori. Ori was in high school, smoked, and was so good-looking he had to fight the girls off him. Perry was his little brother. He was about 11 years old. He had big brown eyes and long hair. He had perfected the art of annoying his big brother, and he turned his talent on Eddie and his brothers in short order. One day, Perry was riding the swing, and Eddie was pushing. Perry was making comments about how weak Eddie was, how ugly he was, how inept he was, how unintelligent he was, and Eddie was getting a little tired of it. He looked at Perry, swinging away on the rope, and then he looked at the control rope he held in his hand. An evil thought came into his head, and he didn't fight it very hard. He jerked back on that rope, and Perry nearly did a backflip out of the swing. When Perry sailed out the next time, Eddie pulled harder. Perry was going higher and higher. His feet were nearly hitting the top limbs of the apple tree. He began to get scared, and he told Eddie he wanted down. But Eddie wasn't in the mood to let Perry down. He pulled harder, and Perry began to beg. "Ah, be quiet, you little chicken," said Eddie. "Let me down," screamed Perry. "I'm gonna fall." "You aren't gonna fall," Eddie said with exasperation. Then Perry fell. It was spectacular. As he sailed out into the blue, he sort of came disconnected from the swing. He flapped his arms like a young buzzard. He turned a slow somersault in the air, and then he hit the ground with a sickening thud. Eddie just stood and stared. "Oh, my arms," moaned Perry. Eddie breathed a sigh of relief. At least Perry was still alive. Eddie ran down the hill. He'd recovered enough to think of a sarcastic remark, but just as he was going to make it, he looked down at Perry. Both his arms were bent like the gooseneck on a bicycle. It made Eddie feel queasy. He didn't want to think what it made Perry feel like. Suddenly he became very concerned and felt horribly guilty. He gently helped Perry to his feet and led him toward the house. Coming through the back door, Eddie bumped into his mom, who was talking on the phone. "Mom! Mom! Perry's broken his arms!" Eddie gasped. His mother put her hand over the phone and glanced at Perry. He seemed to be conscious and breathing. "Put him over there on the couch," she said. "I'll get to him when I get off the phone." Eddie felt a mixture of emotions. On one hand, his own conscience was hurting him just a little less than Perry's arms. On the other hand, he had to admire his mother's cool, calm, and collected attitude. He wondered sometimes if ice water didn't run in her veins. Perry came back from the hospital sporting 2 shiny white casts. He enjoyed having them signed, but he didn't do much swinging after that. His arms might have been broken, but his annoying habits certainly weren't. One afternoon, some old golf clubs showed up at the house, and the boys began to practice for the Masters. They'd hit those balls all over the weedy backyard. Sometimes a ball would fly further and disappear over the hill. Thus it was, Eddie found himself slashing through the weeds as he ranged over the hillside looking for his golf ball. On one circuit, as he was coming up the hill, he came upon an old tree stump. Perched on that stump was an enormous copperhead snake, coiled and ready for business. Eddie jumped back, but he didn't panic. He looked around for a weapon. All of a sudden, he realized he had a shining 9-iron in his hand. What a coincidence! The copperhead was teed up perfectly. So Eddie took his stance. He wiggled once or twice like the pros and hollered, "4!" The 9-iron arced gracefully through the air, and the head of the snake sailed 50 yards through the air before landing right beside the imaginary 18th hole. One afternoon, a friend of Eddie's father climbed the hill on a big Honda 650 motorcycle. While the men were inside talking, Eddie and the boys lovingly looked over every inch of the shiny red bike. What a machine! Finally, Eddie got up the nerve to go inside and ask permission to ride it. "No problem," said his dad's friend, and tossed him the key. Eddie trembled with excitement. Outside, however, it was a different matter. Eddie had never ridden a motorcycle before. He'd never operated a machine that had a clutch either. When he tried to start the bike, it stalled. He tried again. It stalled again. "Give it more gas," his brothers urged. So Eddie opened her wide up and popped the clutch. In a heart-swallowing second, dirt flew backwards and the front wheel lifted off the ground. Eddie hung on for dear life. Just as soon as he was able to get his balance, he looked up to see the sawdust pile right ahead of him. There was no time to swerve, and the accelerator was still open wide. He hit the sawdust and sailed 10 feet through the air. When he landed, he bounced once and went over sideways in the tomato patch. The heavy bike was sitting on his leg, and the manifold was red hot. Eddie, struggling to keep it off his leg, was unable to release the accelerator, and the back tire was chewing through tomatoes like there was no tomorrow. When he was finally rescued, Eddie hobbled inside and sat down. Maybe he'd wait until he got a little bigger or found a smaller motorcycle before trying to ride again. This playing outside stuff could get a fellow killed.